The Investment Director at Glenmont. Welcome, Isabel.
John
Salazar Rodriguez, CEO of Gazelle Wind Power, and Matthias Tuft, CEO of BayWa. So to open, Isabel, since you're in the middle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, in terms of an introduction, right? So, hello everyone, Isabel Rodriguez de Rivera. I'm an investment director in Glenmont Partners. I'm focused in investment and development activities in Southern Europe. I've been working in renewables for the past 12 years, holding different senior investment positions in both London and Madrid. In terms of Glenmont, we are a European fund manager, one of the largest in Europe. We've been operating for over 13 years, and we have over 2 billion euros of assets under management in Europe. Notably, Glenmont has been acquired by Nuveen in 2021. Nuveen is a global leader investment manager with over $3 billion of assets under management as well. And this acquisition will contribute the growth of Glenmont with a different suite of new projects backed by seed capital.
Okay, thank you. John, do you want to go next?
Sure. Welcome everybody. I'm John Salazar, founder and president of Gazelle Wind Power. Thanks a lot to GWEC for inviting us here and for our fellow co-panelists. I'm sure we have a great time today. Gazelle is a technology provider and project co-developer for floating offshore wind platforms. At Gazelle, we're introducing the next generation of floating offshore wind platforms, taking the best of the TLP and current semi-submersibles and eliminating the drawbacks. We have a very strong board of directors behind the company, including recently appointed CEO of Mitsubishi Power, Javier Cavada, Connie Hedegaard, former Minister of Energy and Industry from Denmark, David Mesonero, former CFO from Siemens Gamesa, as well as some of the leading investors in the energy transition. I'm very excited to be here today and all together with the industry to be making floating offshore wind affordable at scale.
Thank you, Matthias.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for having me today. I'm Matthias Tuft. I'm the CEO of BayWa RE. So that's the renewable energy arm of BayWa, and I'm in the business of renewables now than almost 30 years. So we started before talking about the first wind turbines which have been erected in Germany more than 20 years ago. Now we are starting to repowering them. But our company and I representing now more than 3,000 people working globally, mainly in Europe, in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and in the APEC region. So we are probably the biggest distributor for solar panels and solar components globally, and we are amongst the top developer for wind onshore, solar here, ground-mounted, floating, agri-PV, and rooftop installations. And we started our offshore activities here in Europe 2 years ago. And we are very excited to hopefully get awarded in one of the next tenders. So that's our business, and headquarters in Munich. So we are German-based, but as I mentioned before, 3,000 people across the globe. The most of the people are working in Europe, but we have already 400 people in the US or in Americas region, and roughly 200 in APEC.
Thank you. So the wind industry is seen as a relative success in Europe, certainly in certain countries. And so perhaps each of you can just outline why Europe has managed to move ahead. What do you need? What were those key factors at the beginning for success? And then we'll perhaps pull out a few lessons. Do you want to go first? You look very enthusiastic.
No, because we, as I said, our headquarters in Europe, and we are active in all countries in Europe. So we started in Germany, France, Spain, Italy. Now today I have Gordon with me, our UK MD. So we have a very significant pipeline as well in the UK. It started all, and when I talk about that, in Germany with a so-called feed-in tariff. I think that was the stimulus which was necessary and helpful to get the first projects done. And over the years, we have seen more competition, the prices dropped. In these days, to be honest, we still have feed-in tariffs, for instance, in France and in Germany, but actually on good sides or on very attractive sides, we do not need any tariffs anymore because the electricity prices are very attractive. And with the huge turbines, with the huge rotor diameters, the high full load hours, we are able to provide electricity on grid level, grid parity level. So together with the so-called PPAs, I think we are completely flexible. So we see projects where we heading directly to PPAs, off-takers, industrial off-takers, and we have smaller projects where we still participate in the tender to get a feed-in tariff. But this was, going back now 20, 25 years, this was the stimulus which was necessary to establish a European wind industry.
Thanks. And John, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So I agree that the story of wind in Europe is a successful story and also a painful story. On the one hand, of course, we see wind projects at 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Nowadays, building an onshore wind farm is cheaper than building a combined cycle power plant. So for sure, you look at Dogger Bank, for example, and you can see these projects at 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So it indeed was a success. We need to learn a lot because it took a while to take off. I agree with Matthias, to build a new industry, and particularly looking at new markets, will be very important to have that stimulus. So then at some point the industry can catch up, can pick it up, and then it pays for itself.
Yeah, thank you. And Isabel, so as we've said, there's been progress, but it's been quite slow, and especially in certain countries. We don't have a lot more time if we're going to bring the amount of renewables on board that's being talked about. What are the lessons that have been learned so that the progress elsewhere can happen quicker?
So yeah, firstly, I agree with everything that has been said on the board so far. I think it's important that we recognize the fact that there are still existing barriers at different levels, no? And these include technology, economic, socio-political, and environmental, no? And all of these could hinder the further progress of the onshore wind in Europe. So I think it's important that we continue to mitigate these existing barriers. I think we still need to have these policies and measures like innovative business models, and also including financial instruments that can help develop the technology further. I think we are approaching an era where, for example, we have developed a number of onshore wind farms, and these old wind farms have been placed in the positions where, for example, the wind was more favorable. We have to look now, for example, at options like repowering. We have to accommodate the grid. This has to be considered, and it has to be accompanied by the right policies and measures. And it's important as well to mention the important role of financing. So it's been mentioned that we have moved from the feed-in tariff to a PPA, which is absolutely true. The LCOE continues to decrease, but I think the financing has to accompany this progress so that it's possible to enable an effective financing of these investments.
Okay, and you mentioned different actors working together. How important has regional integration been in developing the wind industry in Europe? John, do you want to go?
Sure. So indeed, that's something that will be very, very important because it means that you can have economies of scale. The market is larger, but I would say that despite the lack of regional integration, such as in other places, there is not a common EU energy policy, for instance. Despite that, we've been able to go through the learnings, and as Isabel was saying, we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep looking at deployment at scale, so the new technologies can be the risk as well.
And do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I see it a little bit different because depending a little bit what you understand under regional integration. For sure, I think what is helpful is a European-wide CO2 certificate system. I think that is helpful. We need grid connections, inter connections between the countries, so that's all helpful. But when it comes to wind deployment of wind projects, then we need the local involvement, and that's something which is, from my point of view, the bottleneck in the future, because we have deployed now 2.5 gigawatt wind onshore, the same amount for solar. So we know how things have to be done. We know we have enough financing available, so that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is really the acceptance from the people, the local people. All stakeholders have to be involved. We have grid congestion, so we need more grid access, site availability, permitting. So that's the real problem, and therefore we need to involve all stakeholders from the community, the local community, the regional planning areas, and that's by far more intensive, and it takes longer. And here we have to speed up because we are running out of time, and therefore we need the support from all the politicians, from the governments, that they support our idea to deploy more wind and more solar and more offshore, whatever it is. So here I think that has been sometimes a little bit frustrating, because it's very easy to increase the objectives, the targets, and on the other side, we are really running behind, or we are not able to get all the projects deployed. One further example, in Germany, we have still tenders. They are all undersubscribed. So we can get more to tariff, we get very high prices, but we simply do not have enough projects available because there are no further permits available. So there will be, with the new government, further measurements coming into place, so that especially the planning regions have to designate more sites, more land, which is then dedicated for wind. But this one, again, takes a lot of time. So I think that's our key headache we have here in a further deployment and in a faster deployment of wind onshore and wind solar and offshore. That's more or less the same topic.
Thank you. Is there anybody in the audience who wants to raise any questions to the panel? We're going to be very quiet. And perhaps we could further build on what you've just said. I mean, are there examples of good practice? I mean, the UK seems an area of good practice in terms of offshore wind. And then if there are areas of good practice, are these lessons being shared enough widely in Europe and with other countries so that we do speed up and we don't keep just repeating the same mistakes of the past?
I think from a technical point of view, from a technology point of view, absolutely. I think here we use all the knowledge we have across all countries. With regard to permitting, here I think every country has its own style, has its own approach. When I think about France, it has been always a nightmare, because it was so easy to go for a recours and then you have lost another 1 or 2 years. I think now they changed it a little bit, so they changed their mind here, so that's very helpful and supportive, but we still running out of time. So a normal planning process in Germany, in France, will always last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and that's too long. And yeah, so unfortunately, that's still the case. And here we wish to get more support to get things easier. And I repeat myself here, we need the overarching understanding, the strategic understanding what is necessary, that the politicians are supportive, and all the other in the community, all stakeholders, but then, because then it's getting a little bit easier and we can get a permit in a shorter period of time. In case they are fighting against it, then it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 further rounds until we have then our irrevocable building permit in hand.
Okay, thank you. John, you wanted to comment?
Yes, let me put 2 more ideas on the table related to this. As at a 10,000-meter view, we can highlight 3 challenges to have the type of deployment that Matthias and Isabel are supporting and support too. From the regulatory perspective, it's if we summarize the discussion, is we need clarity. We need to know from these regional authorities how many gigawatts by when, because that at the end leads to certainty. And for example, if we look at the newer markets of floating offshore wind, for example, we look at the average floating offshore wind farm, that will be a $2-3 billion investment. That will generate thousands of jobs. So you need to give the certainty for the supply chain to pick up at some point the industry and reach that deployment at scale. Now, in order to achieve that, you need to create stimulus. And then is when we can look what happened in onshore wind in the old days. We can look what happened in the latest years. We look at the UK, for example, we can see the circa 19 billion pounds invested since 2016 in offshore. We can see what happened in France, pledging probably 3 million euros for pilot projects. Also, if we look globally, we look what's happening in other markets such as Japan. That sends a very strong message in terms of certainty. So on the one side is that regulatory or all that roadmap, we need clarity. And On the other side, there is also a technological challenge for the newer markets and a supply chain challenge. And that's where at Gazelle we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot from looking at the technologies that have been deployed in the last decade for fixed, for floating offshore. We need to introduce, this is how we see it, we need to push innovation. And for that, we need also stimulus for research and development, because unless we have new technologies that are more modular, that are more light, that we can use less steel, it's very difficult to have mass production at scale. And that's what eventually will make this a great success. This can be a massive, massive market if we do things in the right timing and in the right way.
Thank you. I think the gentleman over there wanted to ask a question.
So in terms of permits for land, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's both local people and political leaders that are barriers. And if so, what have you done? What have you been able to do in order to change that? And the second question, do you have barriers in terms of electric grids that need to be updated?
Yeah, maybe the second question, absolutely. Yes, also.
So just to make sure that we bring Isabel as well in there. Do you carry on speaking, then I'll bring Isabel in afterwards.
Okay. No, absolutely clear. So the grid has to be strengthened on all levels. And here, I think the government is spending a lot of money to do that. But again, we need as well some time here. You have a planning phase, and until everything is then really there and done, and we're losing as well a lot of time, because here again we see a lot of resistance in building further high voltage lines over the country. But anyhow, this is ongoing. I think there is a plan in place, but it will take some time. With regard to the local acceptance, which is really key from our point of view, we have involved all stakeholders. We have, for instance, in France, we have created some crowdfunding so that they can really participate. You have to reach out, we have to talk to the people, we have to involve them, you have to give a lot of information, you have to educate people so that they really understand that it is acceptable that they have a wind farm beside your small town. But it is a lot of effort, it costs you money and time, but it is necessary. Otherwise, you will not get there, and then you will have not the support from the politicians, from the mayor, from the local community. So I think that's our lesson learned, which changed over the years. But it's even more important than it was in the past to get even more installations, because in some countries or in some regions we have already a lot. So a lot of people are getting tired about when we tell them now we want to repower, the turbines getting higher, etc., etc. So, and therefore you need acceptance, and you only can achieve it by talking to the people.
Are these permits mostly permanent or temporary?
The permits. The permits are so depending a little bit on the country, so that's differently. But first of all, you have a building permit and then an operational permit, and in most cases that's for 20-25 years. So that's for the whole full lifetime of the technology.
Just to add an out-of-the-box idea on this sense, also it's a matter of resources. It's a matter of limited resources in some places. The best sites, particularly we look in Europe, the best sites for onshore are being taken. And also for making this a big success story, we need to get into newer markets. We need to look on deep waters beyond 60 meters in depth, as over 63% of the global wind resources are offshore. So it's very exciting, and newer markets will also play a key role in achieving this global transition and keeping the way to 1.5 degrees of global warming for the next century.
Thank you. Isabel, did you want to come in on this?
I couldn't really listen to the question.
Okay, the question was about permitting and whether there's what around permitting and how difficult it is.
Okay, so I think it's been said on the table that permitting really depends on a country by country. I mean, there are a number of bottlenecks in the different countries where you operate renewables. Spain has particular bottlenecks with regards to the grid, for example. And if you're looking into Italy, the bottleneck is more on the land side. So there are different barriers that accompany the development of a renewable energy project, even if it's wind or even if it's solar. And I think are these barriers that had to be treated in order to just move forward. And that goes together with what we said before, right? Is in terms of having a clear regulatory framework that provides stability and clarity in terms of the process that need to be followed. I think it's also very important to consider what is the investor confidence in the countries where we try to incorporate the renewables. So these subsequent changes on the way of treatment or regulatory changes do not help. And this is something that also has to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. And John, you mentioned before the steel sector, and wind energy needs to be part of a bigger debate now. It's not just a single sector, it's part of the whole decarbonisation process. And so how can that work, that the wind sector is now driving not just renewables, but also a wider decarbonisation?
Absolutely. It's not just providing clean and affordable energy through wind. Just bear in mind the amount of steel that you require to manufacture to enable this industry. For example, with the platforms, that's been one of our key learnings in our company. We're doing things differently at Gasel. We are separating the floatability and the stability that allows us to use a third of the steel of the initial platforms. And that, if we quantify that, for instance, per gigawatt installed, that can be 650 kilotons of equivalent CO2 emissions reduced by using less steel. So, of course, it affects a lot of industries. There's been this variation of steel prices as well. It's a great opportunity. We have still time. Great opportunity to do this in a way that we lower all the emissions too, if we do this smartly and foster innovation.
Yeah, I agree. On the other side, I think we really have to think about we have to talk about the full supply chain. So it is not only for sure to install more wind and solar, but we have to look at the full supply chain, the decarbonization of the full supply chain. And therefore, we need even more wind and solar installation, especially when it comes and when we think about the hard to abate sector. So that's the heavy industry, the chemical industry, the steel industry, and they need probably not only green electricity, they need hydrogen, green hydrogen, and therefore you again need green electricity. And therefore, I think we need much more wind offshore to have more base load, more full load hours. We need onshore, we need PV installations. So I think it's not the question whether we should push more wind or solar. We need all and everything to get the whole transition really done. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's my message. So especially for the hard to abate industry, we need solutions so that because this is a huge amount of energy we have to transform, and it's not only the electricity sector as such.
Yeah, just to follow up with this, I agree. We're really transitioning to a whole renewable ecosystem. We need everything. We need wind, we need solar, we need energy storage, we need hydrogen, and particularly applying to wind, green hydrogen will create a massive demand. That's what we foresee. For example, for offshore wind. But I'm in agreement with that. It's the whole supply chain. We need also to reach that level of deployment at scale. And for that, we need both things. We need the technology and the supply chain coupled together, everything modular, everything able to be manufactured in an intelligent way for achieving mass production and that utility scale level.
And Isabel, to put in place the vision that John has just outlined, we also need to think outside the silos, perhaps. So the wind energy just doesn't work with the wind energy. It works with, as you said, the grid, people in charge of the grids, and a much wider set of people. Is that now starting to happen increasingly, or is it still quite siloed how this all happens?
I think it's still, I mean, let's put it this way, I think there is still work to be done. I think we have a very ambitious plan to integrate more and more renewables into the system. In order to do this integration of renewables, which is by definition and not flexible generation, we need to just make it work so that these flexibility requirements are diminished. And in order to do that, for example, a transnational Europe would help, because the flexibility requirements for like a connected continent are far lower than if we are not connected, for example. I think in the case of Spain, for example, there is like a very ambitious plan to just install 50 gigawatts by 2030. And by doing that, we really need a stronger grid system, for example. I think this goes together with everything that has been mentioned before. I mean, there are a number of barriers that have been discussed. but we have touched upon the key ones, which are the technology improvements, the specialization and the standardization is key. We also need a wide base of experience and international active project developers, right? Because I mean, we have now at the moment some key developers that are quite active in an isolated country, but when you have this integration to different countries is when you start to see the difference. But it has to be coupled together with the support in terms of the regulatory support, so that everything is connected. I mean, not by having a specialist company and specialist developers, we can get there. And we do have ambitious plans ahead.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yep, the gentleman at the back.
Could you just comment a bit more on the relative growth potential of floating versus, talk about offshore floating versus fixed offshore? It's quite an early stage, I understand it, but what is the growth potential there?
Well, the growth potential is massive. I mean, you look at the latest DNB report, for example, they are calling at 264 gigawatts by 2050. That's a market worth in excess several $1 trillion. You look at more aggressive targets, for example, GWEC Market Intelligence and IRENA, they're targeting 2 terawatt by 2050. So the projections are there. There is still a huge gap. But what we can say with certainty is that more and more the intent is there. We can look at comparables. We can look at astute investors jumping from oil and gas, coming from oil and gas into this industry. There are still challenges to be addressed for this market to happen. We mentioned before, as we see at Gazelle, there is still a technology challenge in terms of the platforms and the moorings. 36% of the total cost of that market is going to be the platforms and the moorings. That's what we are doing in our company, trying to make this affordable, very light, for mass production, modular. There is that challenge at the supply chain level that Matthias was pointing out before. You need to not just put a pilot project, and that's a great learning experience, but you need to start thinking of how towards the end of the next decade you are going to be deploying hundreds of platforms, hundreds of solutions. Lastly is that regulatory point that we've been discussing across the panel. We need clarity. So this clarity translates in certainty. That's the key word. You need certainty. So the supply chain, at some point, once the industry is picking up, once you receive that stimulus, the supply chain can keep developing this project. But the potential is massive. I mentioned before, 63. There are some research that say that 63% of the wind resources are on what we call deep sea waters. For getting on deep sea waters, you need to go floating, because you need to keep these skyscrapers. I mean, we are talking about putting 150 meters in height, 200 meters in height skyscraper that needs to be floating and needs to be stable, because if it has too much sway, the wind turbine will cease the operation. So that's what we're trying to solve. But the technology is starting to be there for being scale. And the golden era will be the 2030s. And this is very exciting. It's a positive message. It's 2021. We are at the infancy. We need stimulus. We need also to improve the R&D programs. So companies like ourselves, we can put our technologies into the market, but the potential is vast. And 10 years from now, it's going to be super exciting.
Manufacturing hub in Asia for the platform.
Sorry, could you just say your question again?
Manufacturing hub for the platform, predominantly European platform, predominantly in Asia, with the shipbuilding and Greek infrastructure. This is the transition from the oil and gas.
Sorry, can I just say the question online? Otherwise, the people can't hear it because they've not got mics. So the first question was about floating wind, and the second one is about whether the manufacturing will be in Europe rather than Asia. Okay, will it be in Asia? Okay.
So the answer is it's super early, and we can see even global tendencies on this. We can see blue collar jobs being imported. And we can see, and in the next panel about the US, probably the Jones Act will appear at some point. But we can see global tendencies where the countries are trying to protect that manufacturing. It's very early. At the moment, you can see pilot projects, but the first commercial floating offshore wind farms are not there yet. You can see some pre-commercial projects, and at the end, these are being done everywhere. What we are doing is doing this in a modular way, so we could manufacture everywhere. We could assemble this locally, so we can generate jobs at a local level, and then just do the installation locally. It's early, so it's open at the moment.
I think that's the solution. So we are participating in the Scottish tender and with 2 partners, and we are very sure in case we get awarded and we are looking for and seeking for a gigawatt, then there will be a local production for the floating system. I don't believe there might be some components produced somewhere else, but it has to be assembled locally. So you can't ship them around the globe. That doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Isabel, did you want to add anything on the floating wind?
No, I think it's what has been said is completely in agreement.
Okay,
Let me add one last idea.
John is very excited by this.
I'm just super passionate about this. But the thing is, this will be done in a very bespoke manner too, because it depends on the seabed conditions, on the wave, on the wind, on the tide, on the current. So it will be done each project will be done in a very bespoke manner. So in one part of the world, it may be this type of mooring solution and platform, and in another part of the world, a different one. That's what we expect. We expect 5-6 designs to be out there as the standards, and that's what we want to be at Gazelle, one of the global benchmarks.
Yep.
I have a small question. You talked a lot about upscaling and innovation, and well, from most technical perspective, so increasing efficiency and really going for bigger, larger wind turbines. I wonder, like, you also have the societal challenges and the ecological challenges. And I recently just heard about wind farm in Norway, the largest being closed down on the Samiland, and in France they are now had a case of local people complaining about noise, and they got just compensation of more than 100,000 euro. How do you look at innovation and taking up this kind of events in the sector? But I can imagine it could be a huge obstacle for.
Yes, so I think so. The question is public acceptance, especially as we get bigger wind turbines. John was talking about very big offshore wind turbines, for example, and we obviously have Marine Le Pen, who says if she were elected, she would stop all wind turbines tomorrow in France and dismantle them all.
When you go beyond 20 kilometers from the coast, something magic happens, which is you cannot see these things. For starting, also what we are doing, at least with our floating platforms, we don't need to have heavy perforations, heavy installation. So it's floating. The solutions are floating. The challenge is different one. We are looking to use materials that are that create associated impact. And of course, we are talking about enabling an industry. We were mentioning before some numbers: 2 terawatt or 264 gigawatt, quoting DNV. That's a massive industry. It's going to attract massive talent from other industries that may be in decline. So we are talking about generating hundreds of thousands of jobs, not just in Europe and the US, but globally. So that's our 2 cents, or how I see that what drives this.
Yeah, I agree about the potential, but I think there are still, always what we learned that new concerns come back. So I wonder if that process of innovation, and you're already trying to think and maybe anticipate some of the concerns that would also, I can imagine, come up offshore. And
that's part of the development, and I know the specific case in Norway, and it seems that they have been not involved from the beginning, and now they have to roll back and they will participate, so they will get some money for it, and then for sure they will operate the project further. So they will not stop that, but it shows that they probably have developed, they got an agreement, but they have not involved all stakeholders, and exactly that's what I said before. And this counts for a small project, same as for a big project, and it counts for onshore as well for offshore. There might be maybe some people not care about offshore project because they are pretty far away out there, but there are other NGOs who are very interested in looking about that, what's going on there in the sea, and you have to involve them as well. So it's a lot of work, and I think it's not the way that you can decide top down. So it is both. We need guidance, we need the targets, but we have to involve all stakeholders, the local people, but as well all the NGOs and all the parties who are involved and have a certain interest in such a project. And then you have to find an agreement with them. It will take some time, but only with this you have to support for professional long operation of such a project.
And this is perhaps part of a wider conversation that society needs to have about climate action in general and what
absolutely
would happen.
Absolutely.
It's not a very siloed. So
I think you partially answered my question. We're talking about stakeholder collaboration and engagement, but just following up on my colleague's question, for this is relevant to floating platforms far offshore, how much, but I think it's relevant to the whole industry, especially with what you've learned so far. I work for a conservation science nonprofit in California, so we're just starting to get involved in offshore wind energy leases. And so my question is, after that long introduction, how much are biodiversity impacts considered when we start thinking about installations, especially new wind?
Okay, I'd like to bring Isabel in, please,
Sure.
because she's not managed to speak. So Isabel, the question was, what are the impacts on biodiversity, or what's been looked at in terms of the impacts on biodiversity of offshore and floating as well?
Okay. I mean, to be honest, on the development of both onshore wind and offshore wind, I am closer to the onshore wind, but biodiversity is always considered at the heart of everything. I think for us, for example, in Lemon, we always take ESG considerations at the heart of every single investment decision, right? The amount of technical due diligence an analysis that is put before like this project get any type of environmental approval is quite thorough and detailed. So this level of analysis is actually taken into account in the development of new projects. It happens with onshore wind, it happens with offshore wind, it happens with solar. You take into account, for example, birds migration, the cycle of the birds, the existing of the animals passing through, and that's already taken into account in the development of these new projects. So that impact is already well considered in the development process.
Okay, John, did you want to?
No, yes, it's exactly that. I completely agree with Isabel. And I talk to you as someone that is going through all this technical process end to end across the supply chain of our projects, and it's very, very thorough. And even for a pilot project, you need to consider all these specifications for the installation, for the decommissioning. You cannot just do the project and leave the things there. Of course, everything is very, very measured, and on top of this, I will say that it's also early. To be fair, it's early to measure that impact because it's a new industry. We need to put those first pilot projects, taking into consideration all these things. I can tell you, I can see that the intent is there to be aligned. Use materials that are eco-friendly, that reduce the impact just by not doing the heavy installations. We expect that will be verifiable, but of course we need to deploy these projects and we need to measure that. It's early, to be fair, and respond to your question.
Thank you. I think we're probably going to have to close there because we have the second panel coming now on the US, but the main learning from the EU seems to be inclusion and working with other people so that you have everybody on board to move things forward. So thank you very much to our three speakers. Hopefully, Isabel, you could follow what was going on. Okay.
Thank you very much for supporting on that.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you. And we'll move on to the US now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, you're Alex. Okay. You sent me an email yesterday about Mexico yesterday. Yeah, no, we should catch up at some stage. Like, do you want to wherever you can, ladies in the middle if you want to go. Oh, sure, right. Okay. That's good. Okay. Okay, so sorry, your name is Dylan Mitchell. At least that's easy to remember. That's a super complicated name. That's it written down. That's really useless. But you're from the same company. Yeah. That's discussion looking at the US. Obviously, the US was a little bit slower in getting going in terms of wind, but we'll hear where the US is up to and what's happening there. So with us today, we have Dylan Mitchell. This is not Thomas Bruno, but Dylan Mitchell. Sorry, Thomas Laurent from Excelos. We have André Fernandez from IR and sorry. From EDPR Renewables. It's not very well written on my screen here, sorry. Got a big explanation. And Katie Theo Herodes, who is Secretary of State of Energy and Environmental Affairs for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So thank you very much for being with us today. Apologies for me stumbling over everybody's names. And yeah, perhaps will just go around and you can all introduce yourself. So do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So André Fernandes, basically head of investor relations and sustainability and planning control at EDP Renewables. My background has been mostly M&A and the strategy at EDP Group, which EDP Renewables is part of. And about EDP Renewables, so we have around 13 gigawatts of renewable capacity installed. We are among what is now known as the renewable super majors. We have presence in Europe, in North America, in Latin America. We have recently, last week actually, announced the entry in Asia Pacific. We are present across wind onshore, solar, and also offshore, where we have a partnership with Engie. And so our vehicle for investment in offshore is Ocean Wind. And just focusing a little bit on ocean wind, which is the topic here on offshore in the US. So on offshore, we have quite around 500 megawatts already operating. We have 1 gigawatt here in Scotland, which is actually has recently been energized to the grid. So it's going to start officially operation soon. And we have also large projects under development in France, in Poland. We have in the US the Mayflower project, which we are upsizing to around 2 gigawatts as of now. We have also a couple of floating projects, and we are also here in Scotland participating in the ScotWind auction that is currently ongoing. And well, and with this,
It's good. Thank you, Katie.
Sure. Katie Theoharides. I oversee our 6 energy and environmental agencies in Massachusetts for Governor Baker. And one of our key priorities is expanding our offshore wind footprint to keep pace with our net zero target for 2050 and a 50% emission reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. We were the first state in the US to move forward on utility scale wind. And one of the things that we really saw there was that the pricing was very competitive. And that really unlocked the US industry and started this expansion up and down the Eastern Seaboard. Now with the federal administration setting a 30 gigawatt goal by 2030, we have significant wind at our back, so to speak, in terms of moving forward. But to give you a sense of the scale we're looking at in Massachusetts, we have 800 that's about to be built right now with Vineyard Wind, another 800 megawatts with Mayflower Wind, and then we're in the process of a 1,600 megawatt procurement right now that will end in December, and we'll announce a bid then. But we're looking to get to 2050. Now, this is a high capacity resource in Massachusetts. And so we're looking at 15 to 25 gigawatts by 2050, which puts us on course for procuring and permitting and siting about a gigawatt a year in the 2030s.
It's very ambitious. Yes. Dylan.
Super. So I'm Dylan Mitchell. I'm the Director for Wind and New Energy at Axelos. I'm replacing my CEO, who's unfortunately had COVID, and so here I am. No problem. So the Axelos, what we do is we're a scale-up company, actually from MIT. And what we do is we bring physics-based simulations, which optimize the design and running of offshore wind structures. We're currently protecting billions of dollars of assets in the mostly oil and gas sector. And I've really been brought in to really bring that technology to bear on the wind industry. And I'm really glad to be on this, and I think on this panel. I've been working on the offshore wind sector now for around 10 years across the supply chain, including working at Vestas Offshore for 3 years as a market entry manager for the United States. So I was very interested in the Vineyard project, and before that even Cape Wind, which we don't talk about anymore. So yeah, that's me.
Super, thanks. So Katie, perhaps we can start with you. So we've heard from the EU perspective that there's been a certain amount of progress, but there are still a certain amount of barriers. What you're aiming to do is very ambitious, and there is lots of ambition across the US now in terms of offshore. And do you think there are lessons to be learned from the EU which can enable you to move forward faster, or are there different challenges that you're up against?
We absolutely have been trying to do as much learning as we can from the European Union on this. And one of the things I've been doing over in Scotland this week is meeting with members of the Scottish government, meeting with offshore wind companies. We have a real opportunity up in the Gulf of Maine, potentially with floating turbines. So was very interested in John's comments about that. You know, I think we share some of the same challenges I heard in the first panel, right? We have state by state environmental permitting decisions that are being made, state by state specific issues around fisheries and view sheds and things of that nature. Although now that we're out in federal waters, a lot of the viewing concerns that plagued the Cape Wind project have really gone away. You know, at the federal level, our first project saw significant challenges under the last administration. That has been righted with the Biden administration, and we know there's going to be a much faster track of going through the national environmental permitting process. So some good news on the environmental permitting front, but some things to learn still about working with stakeholders to site new wind energy areas, which is a key part of getting these pipelines established so we can sort of show the industry that this development is long-term and has a predictable path to market. We also have to build a supply chain in the US, and I think some of that requires coordination among states who are all competing to locate the supply chain in their state. Not everyone's going to have a blade facility, not everyone's going to produce nacelles, but we are all trying to do our best to attract the industry. And a part of that is expanding our ports and getting them ready for this infrastructure. Many of our ports are underutilized now, so this is a great opportunity, but also a significant amount of investment. And the final piece I'd point to that I heard on the first panel as well is transmission is a critical issue. And figuring out how to do that, I think, you know, there are lots of lessons I think we can take from the European experience on, you know, different models for procuring it, for cost allocation, for whether we're building regional networks or state-by-state networks. And so really asking a lot of questions about that this week and trying to do my homework.
Excellent. Andre, did you want to add to what Katie said?
No, I fully agree. So it's mostly around transmission. I would maybe start by that one,
yeah,
because it's many times not given the enough attention. I would say there's in general a lot of discussion about pushing renewables, about having renewable targets and so on, but we need the transmission and networks in general to go hand by hand with renewables, and that is something that is key. Also, as discussed in the European panel, I think this is across all markets and all technologies. The second one, which was also mentioned around the supply chain. I think the advantage that the US may have to a certain extent is that it can plan the supply chain with more time, let's say, and with the experience of Europe. But as mentioned, there are, of course, conflicting incentives between states and so on. But there are already announcements, for example, a blade factory that has been announced by Siemens Gamesa. There is Ørsted also looking into manufacturing facilities in the US, and other players that can also come up with more supply chain and helping to put the puzzle together. And on the licensing side, I think it's already covered in the European panel, and it's pretty much the key points. I would just add that. Fortunately, the US market has always been a PPA-based market, and that is quite important. So the market is very sophisticated in terms of PPAs, and so that helps for sure. And then what was also mentioned in the European panel, the hydrogen can also bring a big push, especially for offshore, I would say. And overall, the targets are there, the ambition is there. The 30 gigawatt target for 2030, this means basically building 4 gigawatts per year between 25 and 2030. And to do that in the next 2, 3, 4 years, you need to have the supply chain, the interconnection, and so on. You also, from a growth perspective, you have all the Build Back Better discussions, the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill discussions ongoing. There are incentives across the board for all renewable technologies, and offshore also has strong incentives. And tying back to the supply chain, also the domestic content and prevailing wage, let's say, objectives around these bills are also important, just to close the circle on everything.
Thank you. And Dylan, from your perspective, what are the key learnings that now need to be applied to the US, and what are the main challenges?
No, I think this is, I think most of the key challenges have already been discussed, really. I think really the 30 by 2030 target, I think we're way on track for. And, you know, it's the same challenges about infrastructure and so on. But I have to say, I think in terms of ambition, I think when we talk about what's realistic, and I'm sorry to bring up another COVID analogy, I think everyone does this 10 times every panel. But if we looked at what was realistic in August 2019, if you'd asked public health authorities what would be possible, or if you'd asked, you know, pharmaceutical industry what's possible, I think they would say something very different to what they say today. And if we then take a what's needed look at the industry, so working from the IEA net zero targets, they're saying we need to be installing 80 gigawatts per year by 2030. That's 9 years away. That's 6 times what's been installed today. Oh, sorry, 12 times what's installed today. It's 2 times what's been installed globally today. So if we then take the United States, that's 17% of global GDP, 16% of the energy use worldwide, or maybe the other way around, sorry. So if we were to take that amount of 80 gigawatts, we're talking about installing 12 gigawatts per year by 2030 in the United States. GWEC has written a wonderful wind report, which is a bottom-up look, and I can only commend them for this. And that says around 4 gigawatts per year is what we'll be installing then. And I think this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about these big targets. So I think we really need to take a root and branch look at what we can do and say, okay, if we are talking about a world where we're installing 12 gigawatts per year in the United States in 2030, what does that mean from a permitting perspective? And I think we can talk a lot about permitting going forward, I think, but we're in a different place to where we were 5 years ago. If you look in 2015, lease sites were going unauctioned. 3 years later, they were being sold for $300 million. The risk is not the same as it was 5 years ago. And so maybe now the regulatory authorities, they can take a bigger slice of the risk. We'd say, okay, the entire coastline, we need to be installing masses of wind turbines out here. So what does that look like? You know, maybe the permitters are going to take a bigger slice of the risk, and we push out more projects. I think this has been the one big thing I've heard more and more. We need more projects. We need more projects. So what would that look like? And I think really we need to be taking a big look at that.
And to have more projects, how does the private sector and the local and the federal level work together in the US that it's as simple as possible and as speedy as possible?
Well, you know, I think one of the challenges continues with this ambition of build, and one of the things that actually scared the regulators when we were coming in with our first project at the federal level was the scale and how they were going to permit just sort of the 30 gigawatts of power off our coast. And so I think innovation from the private sector to solve some of these shared resource uses is key, whether it's fisheries, or we have significant challenges with endangered species. We have 336 right whales left in the world, right? And they transit across Massachusetts Bay every year. And you can't just sort of ignore that and pretend it doesn't exist. And so we need real solutions that will help us track and monitor environmental conditions so that we're responsive to endangered species and other things. We need continued advancement in the technology so we can get the most wind out of the system as efficiently as possible. And we saw that evolve, you know, over just the course of our permitting delays. Our turbine sizes increased significantly. And so we were able to better utilize the wind energy area to get more out of the resource. And so that's, you know, more innovation from the private side. I think port investments and the work that needs to go into those is key. And it's also a real opportunity for the locals to get involved in this. Our cities and communities in Massachusetts on the coast really see a big opportunity to bring economic development and good paying jobs to their communities. And so this has been a reason that many of our cities have gotten behind this and been helpful on the local permitting level as well. But it is sort of a real, you know, we need a cohesive effort of private, state, local, and federal in the US to make this work and to make it work on the timeline.
So Andre, perhaps you could come in from the private side as to how you see this working.
Yeah, sure. I would just add that in most, well, in currently in all the lease auctions and the PPA RFPs, there is from the beginning a criteria of inclusion and a criteria of involving local communities, involving the various stakeholders, and with significant investments dedicated to them. For example, in the Mayflower project, we have up to $50 million of investment in local community around the topics that were mentioned, around how can we improve the ports, how can we improve the harbor for fisheries, how can we also dedicate more or help to shape also the supply chain around the project. A good example, so this is part of the criteria for the selection. And so from that perspective, it's already important. And then obviously from a private, from an investor perspective, in the case of EDP Renewables, we do this and involve the stakeholders from the beginning for all the projects. And the good example is the floating project that we are developing in Humboldt. So it is still early stage, but basically since 2018 that we have been discussing with the Redwood Coast Authority, with the local fishermen's associations, with the Native American population. So trying to involve everyone from the start, understanding the concerns, understanding what can be done, and also how people locally can benefit from the project. And in this case, again, it's a lot around fisheries, around ports, around the supply chain, the jobs that it can create. In some cases also, you have many offshore projects will displace coal plants, which are close to the coast. And so from that perspective, also conversion of employees, of skills, of training, which is involved in these programs.
Do you have anything you wanted to add, Dylan?
No, I have to say, I think I completely agree with everything that's been said as always. So, I mean, it's the same arguments we would hear in my previous life, whether you're talking about Hull in England, Yuri Honjo in Japan, or New Bedford. It's the same sorts of jobs that we're creating. And when you see these wind turbines, you see a tower, you see a blade, there's a lot of air there. So you don't want to transport that. You want that built pretty locally. And so I'm 100% confident the jobs will be created locally. There will be a lot of manufacturing jobs, a lot of operations and services jobs. I think where the industry can do better is when we look at the turbine manufacturers as an example. There's 3 major turbine manufacturers who are working outside of China. You've got Vestas, you have GE, and you have Siemens Gamesa. Now, each of these 3 major turbine manufacturers is backed by a very, very large wallet, let's say. And this is, as these projects grow larger and larger, we're seeing that the warranties, the cost of actually providing for these projects grows with it. I mean, 10 years ago, you could build a wind farm for a few $100 million because of the scale of them. Now we're talking multi-billions of dollars, and when you get to this level, there's a huge warranty cost in it as well. And so what we do with some of the researchers at MIT, there's a lot of very smart people out there creating new technologies, but we need models of actually making sure that these technologies can get into the supply chain. So it's not just, people bashing steel. There's a lot of other jobs that can be created all around the world. And I think part of this is about how do we underwrite them from a regulatory point of view. So, we're actually supporting these smaller suppliers. I think there's still going to be a need for demonstration projects. Small innovative technologies can show what they're doing. Floating wind, of course, but also we're moving into new waters all around the world. If we take the US, you move up to the Gulf of Maine, West Coast, you're looking at floating. The Northeast it's wonderful. It's basically the North Sea. I mean, it's almost the same conditions. But as you get further down the coast, I mean, you start to see bigger hurricane risks, you see lower wind speeds, the technology will be different. And there we're going to need some support still just to make sure that we can develop the technologies which are fit for these particular conditions. So as much as offshore wind, the costs will certainly come down there. I think there will still be a need to some support for a little bit longer.
Thank you. Were there any questions from the floor? Yeah, the gentleman at the back.
I just have maybe a comment, and thanks for your comments about wind and going to the local level. I'm chairman of the Iowa Conservative Energy Forum. It's about all kinds of renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, biodiesel, or ethanol. And as we're helping to get the wind and solar developed in Iowa, it ends up coming down to the local level. you know, we have to interact with the supervisors and those kind of folks. And our biggest job is dispelling the myths that are out there, the fear that's being spread by the antis. And so, you know, that's what we do a lot. We do a lot of op-eds. We connect with the supervisors a lot and try to encourage those kind of things. So just, you know, thanks for that. And that's part of what we have to do.
Well, it's a great point, and we've seen it with both of our projects going through the process now. You know, Vineyard comes on shore on Martha's Vineyard and on Cape Cod, and it goes through very valuable fishing grounds. And so there was a lot of questions, concerns, particularly from fishermen, everything from lost catch to electromagnetic fields. And it's a lot of the developers team, our team, going to local conservation commission meetings, going to select board meetings, and talking in real language about offshore wind, because the terms of art we all use in the energy sector are really clunky for anyone outside of this sector to understand. And so I think it's true not just of this field, but of all of the renewable types of energy. We use a language that not many people speak. And so bringing that down to scale and talking about the solutions and then the economic opportunities and the jobs is so important. Yeah, it's a perfect, yeah. Right.
It's in human food or animal food or wind or solar or biodiesel or ethanol. It's always something, and we're always advancing, and that's what we have to remember. You know, the wind will get better, the solar will get better, what we do gets better, but it's an adaptation and innovation that always moves forward. And you know, the antis are just so discouraging because they spread so much fear. You know. So anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that intervention. Has anybody got any questions you wanted to ask in terms of the US? No? Okay. So I think,
Just curious about the American experience of developing wind energy on farming land indeed, because this is quite a large difference between Europe and the US in terms of what you can do and how much you can develop farming land or in areas that are a little bit better away from highly populated areas.
Katie, do you want to take that?
Well, in Massachusetts, we have no onshore wind, none. And permitting it is it's not a viable, we don't have the land scale that the Midwest has, but there has been a lot of successful onshore wind development in the Midwestern parts of the country, particularly in rural areas. And I think it can coexist with farmlands very well if local opposition is removed. The challenge there is getting the transmission to load centers from really remote rural areas of the US. But you know, it's been frustrating to see. We sort of had an opportunity with hilltop wind in Massachusetts. That's where our best onshore resource would have been. And that was a non-starter. There was no one in the state who was going to let that happen at the local level. So, yeah.
Dylan, did you want to add anything to?
No.
All good.
Solar, we are doing a lot of dual use solar right now, where we co-locate with grazing animals or even with things like cranberry bogs, which are a prevalent agriculture type in Massachusetts.
We're negotiating on solar on our farm, and part of the negotiation is to make sure that we can additionally use that plot of land, you know, for grazing besides their solar.
Yeah.
So we're still producing food at the same time with producing electric energy.
Super, thank you. Sorry, the gentleman over there had a question.
Just one question, alluding a bit to the comment you made on the three manufacturers for offshore, which could be an advantage because they are sizable and they can give some warranties, but at the same time, we're looking at political, right? So would you expect, and also in the maybe that there would be a fourth and a fifth entrant, or is what you mentioned, the bankability and the warranties actually to that nobody can enter this because nobody has the track record. So are we stuck with having these three suppliers for?
I'm curious about this answer.
I'm glad I no longer work for my previous employer. Maybe I can be a bit honest. No, I think the bankability is only growing in concerns in my opinion. There were more offshore manufacturers in the past, but projects have grown to the point now where it is very expensive to underwrite a project, and you need the track record and all of these things. So it is a challenge. And there are other ways around this. If we take, the light bulb, which was, invented over 100 years ago. And during the original New Deal, technology licensing became a major thing, where the government came in and said, okay, you've got a technology which is so important, you need to be able to share this with your competitors and they'll pay you some money, your investment is protected, but we all will benefit from this. And so it's not necessarily a problem that there's 3 manufacturers if they're bringing on board new technologies, if they're able to innovate. The concern is if you've got 3 manufacturers who are quite comfortable, who are, making their profits, that's where there's a challenge. And so from my perspective, it's all about open innovation. It's about bringing in new technologies, making sure other competitors can come on board. And I think, to be quite frank, if we don't, there are other manufacturers, they just happen to be Chinese, and they will definitely eat everyone's breakfast if they're not careful.
Andre, did you want to add?
No, I was actually going to make this comment at the end. There are more than just 3 manufacturers, and so it is a competitive landscape and a competitive sector. It is true that they are very large, but at the end of the day, from our experience, what happens in many of the projects is that we are getting quotes until kind of the last minute of the investment decision, or an auction, or some bilateral PPA discussion that we are having. And we are basically looking at 3, 4, 5 different turbine models of different manufacturers, and they are competitive, and they really go and push to try to get the project. And so it is true that they are not many, but there is competitive tension. And on the other hand, there are more manufacturers also that are there and are growing also.
And we talked in the first panel about the EU being a leader and the US kind of following behind. But I think listening to you, we should all perhaps be sharing our experiences a bit more rather than singling people out as leaders and followers. But in terms of the US now, with Biden now in charge, is there a sense that the offshore wind growth is part of kind of the US repositioning itself again as a leader on climate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the day the Biden administration took office, they moved forward no, I shouldn't say that. It was the day Amanda Lefton, the BOEM director, took office under the Biden administration that our permitting process got back online for the Vineyard project. And I think really allayed a lot of fears for a nascent industry that was just starting to invest in the offshore market in the US. And so that was just one project, but they followed that up with significant opportunities for infrastructure investments, with a 30 gigawatt target, and with the announcement of new wind energy area planning process going forward by Secretary Haaland a few weeks ago back in Boston, actually. So, I see this as a key underpinning of the administration's commitment to net zero by 2050, and also a real part of the linkage between climate change and good paying jobs. That's something the administration is really underscoring, and it's something we've seen in Massachusetts, and something that the state has put a lot of money into is job retraining and diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of that job retraining, so that all of our communities, all of our residents can be lifted up by this net zero transition.
And do you think this, if we talked more about jobs rather than perhaps climate change, that could also help allay some of the fears in certain states or certain communities about what climate action actually means?
I think it helps, right? I think it helps. We just had a major hydro transmission project that got voted down through a referendum last week, and so that had a lot of jobs in rural Maine where there are not a lot of jobs, and that message did not help. It was called in the ballot initiative a high impact transmission line, and you can imagine coming to vote, that wouldn't play well with a lot of people. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think jobs is a good part of the message going forward.
Andre, anything to add, or a final word before we finish in terms of the...
No, I was just going to add, there's a 30 gigawatts ambition. There is also seabed auctions already announced for the next couple of years. New York Bight, you have also the Carolinas, the Gulf of Maine, the Gulf of Mexico, California, Oregon. It's widespreading. You have RFPs for PPAs, which are also pushing, and Massachusetts leading the way with RFPs, but also Connecticut, Rhode Island. They're in the East Coast. There are many RFPs ongoing and expected. to be coming shortly. And so overall, it's not just the high level ambition. There are already very clear auctions and PPAs announced, and that gives us visibility and gives investors visibility of what they can count on for the next 2 or 3 years. On the other hand, and it seems like it is the case, and unfortunately it will be in the next couple of weeks that we should have the final version of the ongoing discussions, where offshore but also renewables will have very strong visibility for the next decade, or basically until the end of the decade. You will have investment credits for all the technologies extended in time, covering also, for example, transmission, again, just in putting transmission within renewables, covering transmission, covering storage, also very important, covering hydrogen, besides covering the onshore wind, solar, and offshore. You have also incentives for manufacturing for the supply chain. And so everything is going in the right direction and is in the right path, I would say.
Can I just add one tiny thing to that? Even before the Biden administration came in and announced the 30 gigawatt target, if you just added up the state's individual targets, we were already there. And so I think there's, I don't want to give too much of a sense that this is going to change every 4 years as the presidential election gets voted on. This is something that, states are very committed to climate action, and we're putting the pieces in place to build that transition. And now we're in partnership with the feds, which is great.
Dylan?
Yeah, no, I was about to say you shouldn't do yourself a disservice. The states have done a really good job of keeping the momentum up during the last administration. I have to say, going back to my original comment about the scale of the challenge we're facing, I don't think any country's really done that yet. No country has really built offshore wind to the scale it could. We in Europe, we've developed, as the industry's grown. When we built these first offshore wind turbines, they were a kilowatt, measured the rating in kilowatts. Now we're building 15 megawatt turbines. So, we've had a chance to grow this. But there are disadvantages to this as well. We built our infrastructure, our ports, our vessels based on those old turbines and then ramped up as we have. It's a bit of a Frankenstein's industry in that, we've taken oil and gas standards and just brought them offshore. And so I would say for the US, everything is there for the market to grow, but there's also an opportunity to really build from the ground up. What would the rules look like for a massive industry? Do we need to build to oil and gas standards, or is the risk slightly different for an offshore wind turbine compared to an oil and gas platform? America is a great country. It's got great people. They have the project managers there. They have the money there. There's no doubt of mine that we're going to hit 30 by 30. I think it's now for me, it's, looking to the horizon, how big could we really go with this industry? And I think, Americans are better at thinking big than us Brits. So I have no doubt, no worries.
I don't think I can close on a better note than that, so I think I won't even attempt to, unless anybody has a final question from the floor. Thank you very much to our three panelists. That was a super interesting discussion, and thank you. Yep, thank you.
Thank you.